Well, hello everyone. Um, yeah, I was fed a question by by an important community member. Do you think that Tesla is investing enough capex um, on the compute side for FSD and Optimus, given the relative size of Cortex versus the training center for Tesla's data center versus say Colossus and others. And part of the analysis of that is it's a bit apples to oranges because training FSD is a bit different than training a large scale LLM like Grok at xAI's Colossus. But that said, it's an interesting question, and I think part of the answer is that um, Tesla and Elon in particular, as the CEO of this company, is pretty darn good at at capital spend, and isn't shy to spend, but it also doesn't overspend, and I think he's kind of Goldilocks it, he's pushing very hard into this, but I think one of the things that's really cool about Elon is that he's got enough cycles under his belt in data center builds to know when he has to spend based on lead times from purchasing chips and supportive hardware to power to physical build out of the data center. I mean, consider this is a guy that literally has been on the floor doing it himself along with the team. So he's highly aware of all the lean times involved. And so if he wants to spend his money, he wants to spend it as to near to near to deployment as possible. And in general, I think that he, I mean, I can't say we don't know how the Cortex cluster runs to train these models, but we can say that it's clearly following the path that more compute is necessary. And there's a couple major trends here. One is they're building bigger models. So version 14 being about 10x the size of version 13. And while it's not a linear relationship, there is a very strong relationship between parameter size to compute required. Also, I think just foundationally in the model, um, when I say foundationally, I wanted to separate this out. We can talk more about it later, but the whole portion of imitation learning, which is the stuff that we normally focus on, I think that foundationally in the model, there's a lot more training data coming in um, now than ever before. I mean, in other words, I think that they're supersizing the training set. And I think there's two reasons. Well, I think there's some catalyzing elements here. One is robotaxi deployment itself. It's starting to really, it's nothing, nothing's better than a deployment. When you get deployment, you start to see what kind of edge cases you have, and you start to want to select more data to treat those edge cases. That's one thing I think is happening. And then I think the other side of this is that I think that and as we'll get into it, I think a bit, but they are really, really, I think, pushing on reinforcement learning to help train the model. So the model really, to kind of summarize this, you've got imitation learning, which is basically using driving samples principally from human drivers, although there's a bunch of data that is simulated as well, and using that to essentially imitate those drivers' behaviors, properly selected and labeled data sets to get the first base layer of this neural network that they train. And then they apply guess we can call it a fine-tuning phase, but it's a lot. I mean, so fine-tuning sounds like it's a small amount of effort, but it's actually probably the larger of the two. Reinforcement learning, where they're actually taking a different approach. And interestingly enough, the thing about reinforcement learning is that from a compute point of view, it requires much more compute. Now, of course, it always depends on how much you're doing, so it's hard to estimate, but it's easily maybe an order of magnitude more compute, because here what you're doing is you're letting a system run a series of independent trajectories that you don't even have in that original source data. So, imagine you collect a piece of data from a user that's driving their Tesla vehicle and it's going through an intersection. It's one piece of data. It's pretty rich. It's 8 cameras. It's, we can express that in terms of how much data might be in that data set, depending on the amount of time captured, how many frames per camera, the rate at which we capture them, the resolution which we capture them, and then the total time. So we have one piece of data there that we could characterize as some number of bytes. We'll call it n. But imagine that we said in our mind, well, we would like to see that individual run that intersection in 100 different varied ways. Like varying the speed in 10-mile-an-hour increments, varying the lane selection from centered left lane, centered right lane, to some variance in between, crossing the lanes. You can imagine hundreds or thousands of potential scenarios.
Time of day, weather.
Yeah, all these things that you would. And so now with this reinforcement learning, what we have is the system essentially simulating all these different scenarios and scoring them. And all I'm really trying to package in this part of the conversation is that increases the data size to process for training massively. So is Cortex big enough? Well, this guy Elon knows, but I would say that as we start to lean in on this, it's pretty clear that, like most things out there in this space of compute, we're learning that more compute is necessary.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your bottom line would be trust Elon. don't ever bet against this guy. That he's on the one hand building the largest computer at this point. Period.